Well, today we're going to discuss just what is meant by the Theosophical Worldview. I suppose the question that is most often asked of any one of us, or we probably have asked it ourselves, is, what is Theosophy? And as you all know, there is no official definition in any document of the Theosophical Society. The General Council, which is the governing body of the society, has never made an official statement, an official resolution saying, now this is Theosophy. So the question continues to be discussed and examined. And of course, some years ago, we developed here in the American section a statement which appears every month on the American Theosophist, the back cover, the Theosophical Worldview. It's interesting that this word, worldview, has somehow come into popular usage only in the last few years. Previously, I suppose we always referred to the Theosophical philosophy, the Theosophical metaphysics, and just Theosophy generally. Since the one unalterable fact that we have to keep in mind is simply the fact that regardless of how we define it, the society from its very inception has been called the Theosophical Society. Now why? What does this embrace? What if we had been called the Eclectic Philosophical Society? Or we had been called the Esoteric Buddhist Society, since the first book that really presented in some sequential order the Theosophical philosophy was that by A.P. Sinnett called Esoteric Buddhism, which led, of course, to all sorts of misunderstandings. Well, we could have been called the Gnostic Philosophical Society, the Esoteric Christian Society, and so on. But I suppose to make matters really intriguing for members and public and so on through all the years, we were called the Theosophical Society. So this must involve a point of view, a particular stance, a particular understanding. And I think it can be approached from a variety of ways. First of all, a worldview involves definitely two aspects. It involves first a particular position which we can call a theory, and I use that because it is from the Greek, a theoria in the Greek, which is from the Greek verb theorein, which is interesting because it's related to the English word theater. I don't know if you realize that, but our word theory is really related to our word theater. And when we use the word theater, you know, what do you think of? What is your immediate image, for example? A stage? Anything else that you think of? When you use the word theater?
Movie.
A movie?
Acting.
Acting, don't you? Yes, acting in some way. A stage in which action takes place. Isn't that right? And so when you observe a theater, you may sit to the left of the stage or the right of the stage or center stage or in a box above the stage and so on in a modern theater, won't you? And where you sit in the theater determines really how you will see the action, isn't it? Very much. And you see, if you sit right, say left of stage, this is left, left of stage, and I'm sitting right of stage, and afterwards I may say to you, did you see what that character did? And you might say, no, I saw it, I didn't see that character, my eyes were on this character. And so that's the basis of theory. It's a looking, it's a mode of looking. And in Sanskrit, this is called darshan, which actually is the same word. The D in Sanskrit becomes a th frequently. These two are cognate in the Indo-European languages, and one finds them. No point in going into all of that. But this is a mode of seeing. And so the schools of Hindu philosophy, for example, are called darshanas, modes of seeing. And I think for the Western mind, for most of us, we say, well, these probably are in conflict, you see. And we see them as opposites. Whereas for the Indian, because all the darshanas are based on the Upanishads, which are the last part of the Vedas, the final section of the Vedas, of each Veda are the Upanishads. These are ways of interpreting the original presentations in the Vedas through the Upanishads. And each is a way of seeing. We are so accustomed to our own theories, to our own ways of seeing, that we forget that there may be other ways to look at the stage of existence, the whole theater of existence. And of course, having developed theater in the round, I suppose you can see it in a sense if you swivel around, but the stage is in the round, and we sit around the stage. But these are modes of seeing. Now, dependent on the mode of seeing, then, is the praxis or practica. Which is, of course, the mode of acting, a way in which one responds to what one has seen. So out of our worldview arises the way we act. And we may not realize it, but if you have a certain theory, if you see the world in a certain way, if you see the world as out there, if you see the world as separate, if you see the world as antagonistic, then you're going to act in that way, aren't you? We all act in that way. If you see the world as part of yourself, you're going to act in another way. There has arisen a kind of new consciousness that maybe the earth is not there to be exploited. Maybe the earth is there to be preserved. Maybe I ought to look after the planet. Maybe it's not there just for me to use up the resources, and so on. And there has arisen this new consciousness of how I protect the earth and how I look after the earth. So everyone has a worldview. For example, here in the West, we are so trained in what we can call two-term logic. A thing is either this or it's that. And all of us have been trained in that, haven't we? And you ask somebody, and they say maybe, you say, well, if you ask a question and you say, no, well, it's either yes or no. And we love yes and no situations, don't we? We love true and false. Well, supposing we lived in the Tibetan culture and grew up in the Tibetan culture, where seven-term logic is taken for granted. Or we had been educated in one of the darshans of Indian philosophy, one of the schools, the Nyaya, which is extremely logical. I think Nyaya means logic, in fact, and it's a very logical system. And in that, there are 14 ways to end an argument. So those of you who like to, really get the better of someone, it's useful to look up the Nyaya school, the darshan, that looks at 14 different ways to conclude an argument. So the Theosophical worldview must then be a particular worldview. It must be a unique worldview. And really it's that we want to look at today. To understand that worldview, I think it's helpful, and I've given you all a sheet, so I'm using a great deal of this. It's particularly helpful to look at one of the really towering figures of Greek philosophy, of Western philosophy. A figure who was very much influenced by contacts indeed with Eastern philosophy, with Indian philosophy. Remember, although this is some centuries ago, there were trade routes between the East and the West, and ideas, not only goods, but ideas flowed. And that towering figure, of course, is Pythagoras, a much neglected figure in Western philosophy. He had a school which involved many, many disciplines: music, mathematics, as well as philosophy itself, grammar, all of the great traditional sciences, and involved a way of living, involved indeed a praxis, a way of living, because one of the great theses of the Theosophical Worldview is that if you would come to the wisdom, you have to live a certain life. In other words, praxis and theory, the practical side and the theory side go together. You cannot, it's not knowledge, in other words, that we're after. You can get knowledge, you can be a great chemist, a great mathematician, even an outstanding musician. In any field you can become great, knowing a great deal, and you can live the lousiest kind of life. In this, according to Pythagoras, you had to live a certain life. And I might just inject that, as I see it, the central message of the secret doctrine, the whole central message, therefore, of the Theosophical Worldview is live the life if you would come to the wisdom. Not knowledge, but if you would come to real knowing. And so Pythagoras, who of course was the teacher of Plato, the teacher of Socrates and therefore of Plato, was the first one to use this word philosophy, which is a very interesting word. We recognize that, sophos, from theosophy, don't we? You see, so that at least we feel, oh yes, that of course is familiar to us, and has to do with a certain wisdom. It's a feminine word. It has to do with, indeed, the kind of view, the kind of wisdom that is not something to be gained, like knowledge, which is added sort of fact by fact in an encyclopedic way, but a kind of overall knowing. It's a kind of, it's a wisdom that emerges from within one's own being, that is not added to so that there's a kind of incrustation around one like knowledge, but rather emerges from the whole perception of the reality of things. What is real? What is fundamental? And therefore, because it arises from within, it is both wisdom and compassion, understanding in the sense of compassion. Now, philos is a particular kind of love. We have only one word for love, as you know. We just say love, and you can love your mother, and you can love apple pie, and you can love your wife, and you can love Alcott, and you can love, all sorts of things, you see. But when you say that, there is very much a difference between saying I love my mother and I love apple pie. And inwardly, there's a difference, isn't there? There's a difference. I would hope you can distinguish. But the word love for us is just one word. The Greeks, of course, had 3 words, didn't they, for love, you see. And we won't go into all of them because we've got to get on with this. But this is a particular kind of love. We have it in the word filial, which means what? Brother, yeah, doesn't it? Brotherly love, you see. And when you say brotherly love or filial, what characteristic seems to arise in your mind? What feeling about it? A quality, but what kind of quality?
No, equality.
Equality, yes, equality. That it's at the same level, as it were.
Peers.
Peers. One's peers, yes. So that there is a relationship that is established in which one is at the same stage, as we could put it. Now, what does that do to wisdom? Think it through. It's interesting to think it through. It means, really, that the wisdom is equal to the consciousness which holds that wisdom, which is established in that wisdom, that there is a kind of equality of you and the wisdom. Do you see? It's a beautiful word that Pythagoras gave to our language. And he was the first to use this. Not that wisdom, knowledge, is outside, which had been the suggestion, you see, that because hitherto Greek thought had really been involved in science, in the investigation of what was outside. Pythagoras suggested, on the contrary, that there is a way in which consciousness is brought into a condition in which wisdom arises. Often philosophy, therefore, is simply translated the love of wisdom, but it's equally the wisdom of love. And many people say what the real translation of philosophy is not love of wisdom, but the wisdom of love. Because both are present, equally present in one. Both compassion, love, and wisdom. And this, of course, in the Eastern tradition is what was the Buddha. It's the bodhicitta, the mind that is established in compassion, in understanding. So I think this is important for really understanding philosophy. Now, Pythagoras suggested there are two great kinds of wisdom, if you like, that there are two fundamental aspects to come to the wisdom. There are ideas, which are principles. These, of course, these ideas are a kind of energy. They're dynamic. They move you. They really carry you into a deeper and deeper realm, a more and more profound understanding. Jacob Needleman, in his work, The Heart of Philosophy, who deals with this better than any other author, I might say, in defining how Pythagoras approached this, points out that the energy of these ideas was spoken of in the ancient languages as a spiritual food. One was nourished by these ideas. They were a kind of manna, sacred food that one ate. And this was really the basis in some of the mystery schools of the communal meal. Not that one simply got together and had a meal together, but that one ate of a spiritual food and one was energized from within. And so these ideas really energized you. And the verbal formulation was only one aspect. And consequently, in many spiritual traditions, silence had to be observed. And indeed, in the Pythagorean school, there was 7 years of silence. And so silence was one way in which one came to these ideas, because they couldn't really be formulated. They couldn't really be said. And the authentic formulation brought one to a kind of interior silence. Now, the second type of ideas we can call concepts or mental constructs. They're what can be called the technical devices of the mind, if you like, problem-solving devices. Needleman calls them the internal equivalent of technologies, the technologies of the mind machine. They lead you perhaps to these ideas, but they are secondary. They do not give an energy that really keeps you exploring. They're not dynamic in that sense that keep you exploring in a multitude of directions. And then, of course, because these ideas move you and these concepts derive from the ideas, there must be values. There must be practical applications, living values. I've struggled over and over with what word could be used there. At one point I used the word derivatives, but I decided that isn't very good because that really doesn't say it. So come up with I'm only suggesting these, and what I'd like to do now in the time that remains to us is to explore some of these and see what you think, how you feel about them. There have been various efforts to sort of organize the great ideas, principles of this worldview. If we can come then, not to just a simple statement, Theosophy is this, but we begin to move behind that to what are these ideas that are really fundamental, that move us, that are dynamic. And as I say, there have been many, many ways in which these have been set forth. But as I've thought it through, I come up with 7 that I think are logical, that are principles, universal principles. And I struggled and struggled with number 1. Actually, I've decided it should not be 7, but it should be 1, which is all-embracing, and 6. And I got that idea out of a quest book that I recommend highly, and which I think is one of the best quest books we've published, Hitchcock's Atoms, Snowflakes, and God. The Theosophical Worldview is really Advaita. It is non-dual. It is not just monistic. And this leads to sort of hair-splitting, perhaps, but because it is a beyond numbered worldview, one arises in which all other permutations are present. And so it's 1 plus 6, perhaps, that is really the correct numbering. I think often of the way in which certain North American Indian tribes count. You see, we count 1, 2, 3, 4, don't we? If I ask you to count off, this is the way you would do it. And you see each number as completely separate from its predecessor, wouldn't you? Now, there are cultures which number 2 is the 2-ness of 1. 3 is the 3-ness of 1. 4 is the 4-ness of 1. Isn't that beautiful? I think it gives another feeling, you see. So there is only 1, and all numbers are but aspects of that 1. Dr. Marie-Louise von Franz, the great Jungian psychologist, deals with this in her book on number and time and in other works that she has written. But there are cultures that deal with this way of counting. So I struggle and struggle with this first one, and I think I finally just put down source. What else? But you may have another word. So don't get hung up on my words over here, but let's look at, if we can, what concepts flow from that. If you want to use ultimate reality, you see here, what concepts then flow from that?
Interconnection?
Interconnection, certainly. I have to abbreviate some of these. Any other?
Brotherhood?
Brotherhood. Unity. I won't spend too much time on all of these, but one begins to see what what concepts begin to flow from this? Think about it. But do you see how they derive from this central principle, this unitary principle, this ultimate reality? All right, what would be the value or the application, the practical, that derives from this? We may not fill this in. I may not put it all on the board, but think about it. What would be an application or a value that flows out of this? Family relationships, certainly, yes. Communication, yes. World citizenship, yes. We live in a global village, it's said now. Isn't that right? It's interesting to use the word communication, because how do we communicate? And in one of the great Tibetan texts that has now been translated by Dr. Herbert Günther in his work, The Matrix of Mystery, it points out in that Tibetan text that one aspect of this primordial emanation, this primordial movement, is communicative thrust. That there is a communicative thrust which is a kind of resounding of the word throughout all of creation. And everything in creation, everything in manifestation, is the resounding of that primordial word. So sometimes you can even put word there, if you understand what's meant by that. Those of you who are familiar with some of the great concepts in the secret doctrine, isn't that the very fabric of the universe which we call Akasha in the Sanskrit? Whose chief characteristic is sound. The vibration carries on. So communication. And so every time we communicate in whatever manner, not just by voice, but by reaching out, by touch, by seeing, even seeing is a manner of communication, isn't it? How I see you. This is a manner of communication if I look at you. All of that is simply the sounding of the one word. You see. Well, there are many we can put over here, aren't there? Well, let's go on because our time is moving along. I use next polarity. As you will see, you may have other words for it, but I use that because out of this emanation of that ultimate reality, there is a polarization. There is a polarization that appears to be into opposites. Now, what concepts might derive from that?
Yin and yang.
Yin and yang, very much so, yes. Very much so. Linda Jo, did you have?
I was thinking, no, I'm on the next one.
Oh, okay. Any others that flow out of that?
Duality.
Duality, yes, of course. Just duality, you see. And you see, if we get stopped with a concept, we see duality then as what? Opposites, don't we? And never the twain shall meet. But when you go back to the fundamental principle underlying it, which we can call polarity or the polarization, what do we see then? That these two are but ends of a continuum, so to speak. Do you see? It's interesting because in one of the Mahatma letters, the Master writes that the only immortal feelings are love and hate. And one wonders, why is hate an immortal feeling? Well, analyze it. I'm not going to tell you why. I mean, why should I give you all the answers? I don't know all the answers, that's why. But think about it, because they're on a continuum. It's a polarization which is typical of manifestation. All manifestation is possible because of polarization. So the yin-yang, duality, good-evil, love-hate, pleasure-pain, all of these are present. And what values then arise? What values then? What applications? How do we live in light of that principle? Any ideas?
Getting married.
Getting married, yes, of course. Because then, in getting married, one goes back then to this relationship, which must be, but because there, you say, and we say we marry opposites. Men marry women, and why do we become concerned over men marrying men or women marrying women? Because it doesn't seem appropriate within the scheme of a polarized, a manifested system. And we have to look at this. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm only saying appropriate, or what arises naturally within a scheme in which there is this polarization. Well, we need, again, to move along. But think about this. You fill in these. You may come up with totally different words throughout. But then, because of this, there is a periodicity. Or I sometimes use the word rhythmicity. What concepts then? Here, Linda Jo, is where you were thinking? Cyclicity, cycles, let's just put cycles. Other concepts? Seasons. What about reincarnation? Many people think reincarnation is a principle. I suggest it's a concept, which with other concepts dealing with it. Because really, if you think about it, there are 14 words that are virtually equivalent to reincarnation. But each has its own unique meaning. Metempsychosis, palingenesis, metamorphosis, many of these words. But each has its unique meaning. We don't have time to go into that today, but it's a whole talk by itself, which we can someday, but you can go into it. All right, all of these, the yugas, the great cycles of periodicity, all of these, even transmigration, which you say, oh no, we don't believe in that. Be careful, because there is a principle of periodicity in that which has a bearing at a certain level. I refer you, for example, to a marvelous article by H.P.B. called The Transmigration of Life Atoms. So there is transmigration, but at a certain level. And it doesn't mean the soul or the egoic consciousness in you is going to come back as an animal, but the very structure of your body may be taken up by animal forms. And that there is a transmigration of life atoms. So all of this. Now, what values arise from that? Any ideas? Quickly? What applications?
Maybe rhythms in our lives?
Rhythms in our lives, yes. Therefore, a greater understanding of our own rhythms, and therefore an understanding of rhythms in other people's lives. You see, you may greet somebody one morning and they're grumpy. And you say, well, what did I do to make you grumpy? Maybe you didn't do anything to make that person grumpy. But there's a kind of cyclicity. And that person is just depressed. Maybe it's the weather, maybe other factors. If you analyze all the problems you face, they really come down to just a very, very few problems. But they are presented to you in a multiplicity of ways. So you deal with them over and over and over again. All right, well, let's go on then. I better watch again the time. Lawfulness. I use the term lawfulness rather than law because I think it gives the aspect of the ness quality, the quality of law, the quality of design or order, you see. And that's why I like the ness on it. So it's a lawfulness that is underlying. And what great concepts, of course, come from that? Karma, order, I've already mentioned that, order, dharma, many you can think of there, can't you? You feel comfortable with that. what values arise from that?
Purity, that nature is regular and not.
Yes, a feeling of security in the universe. One is fitted in because things are in order there. Yes.
About the learning process.
The learning processes, yes, very much so. Yes.
I think there's also the fact that if you believe in this karma or orderliness, that you can't sort of escape the consequences of it.
That's right. You can't escape the consequences. If there's a lawfulness, you know, it's going to be there. And you're seated in the midst of this lawfulness.
An ethical system?
Pardon?
Ethical?
An ethical system, yes, indeed. Yes, very much so.
How about evolution?
Evolution, yes. A plan. There is a plan, and the plan is evolution. Yes. I'm very glad Nancy brought in, I'm going to put it there because I think that's so important, a whole ethical system. These are not set in concrete, but I want to get you started to thinking of them. Try to push back what are really concepts to what are the great ideas that have a dynamism in them, that move you, that lead out, that broaden out. In any event, I use as the fifth analogy or correspondences. HPB, of course, refers to analogy as the fundamental law. And again, she states this, that it is the fundamental principle. And so what concepts flow from analogy?
Relationship.
Relationship, of course.
As above, so below.
As above, so below. All of these great ideas, you see, so that there is this. And then the values that flow from that. One can see so many applications of this. Incidentally, the great myths reveal this, the hero myth particularly.
I don't understand what you mean by analogy, Joy.
Analogy is simply that this corresponds, as above, so below, as it is in the broad. Let's look at the hero myth. Let us take the life of Jesus as the myth of the whole development of the individual. I'm not concerned whether there was such a historical figure. I'm concerned with the great stages in the life of Jesus. And these correspond to the stages in the life that every individual on the way to a greater consciousness, to enlightenment, if you like, to liberation, if you like. These are stages which, in miniature, and we repeat them over and over and over again. I think myth is a great source of understanding, analogy. And this is a guiding principle. If you get the universal principles, said HPB, if you have a comprehension of fundamental principles, for example, one of the great tenets of the whole philosophy that she presents is that everything emerges from within outwards. And if you look at your own life, you begin to see that everything does reflect what is within ourselves. Everything does emerge, both our problems and the solution to our problems emerges from within outwards, not given to us from outside.
So then archetypes.
Archetypes fits in very much. This gives us the archetypes, yes. Yes. So does that become clearer, what is meant by analogy? That if one gets a hold of the law of correspondences, or the law of, and HBB calls it a law, the law of analogy is the Ariadne's thread that will safely guide you through all of the intricate processes of occultism, she says. You see. All right, we have to go on. We have only 5 minutes. The sixth one I call number, and you may wonder about that. But out of analogy, out of all of this, there is a multiplicity, a number which gives then harmony, gives proportion, the right proportion. And that number, whether it's a septonate, whether it's a trinity, whether it's a quaternary, number is in the Pythagorean school, one studied number in terms of geometry, which is right proportion, in terms of mathematics, which is again the harmonic relationship that develops. And so out of number, the value, I think, is indeed that there is again a right relationship, that there is a multiplicity of ways, and yet the way is one, it is said.
Doesn't it always also bring the idea of limitation?
Limitation, yes. Number brings limitation, yes. And so one is, in a sense, one lives within the limitation of one's own being. I think that's a very important, because that makes one focus, too. Number, I think, is a great universal principle, something to be thought about. And finally, I use the term hierarchy, which refers, of course, to stages of development in which each stage is complete in itself. We now have not hierarchy in the sense of graded levels. What was the term you used a moment ago, Shirley? Progression. But in which each stage is whole within itself. Is the full flower of the rose greater than the bud? And yet the bud is for itself perfect. So there are, this of course I'm taking out of general systems theory. So hierarchy refers indeed to the various stages. One can then see the path, the masters, the stages of development, and recognize then that transformation from one stage to another, it is not simply a leaving of one stage, but an incorporation of that stage into a bigger stage, into a wider stage. And transformation occurs. Well, as I say, it's for you to play with these. These are only my suggestions, not by any means, as I say, I am no authority, and that's the wonderful thing in the Theosophical Society. No one is a final authority, not even HPB, but hints, suggestions, and perhaps one way of expressing it leads to a greater comprehension. And perhaps this will excite you to explore further what is the Theosophical worldview. So thanks for being here, and thanks for participating.